the point in time at which technological growth becomes uncontrollable and irreversible, resulting in unforeseeable changes to human civilization. We're not there yet, but there's no question that we're experiencing a speeding up of technological innovation. We all remember Mark Zuckerberg's now abandoned motto, move fast and break things. The industry has a long history and culture of rushing the gate. Make no mistake that many good things have come out of the tech sector, but that has also meant that many times products have been released quickly, broadly, and without ample restrictions, and have gone on to cause great harm, not only in the context of individual lives and communities, but in terms of genocide, cutting off of critical services like health care to large populations, and undermining governments and systems of government, as well as other impacts that have undoubtedly shifted the course of history. Are there ways to consider the development and implementation of these new technologies before they ever see the light of day, before the genie is out of the bottle, in order to prevent some of these major harms? What conversations do we need to be having? And is there ever a time to just say no? These are the questions that we're going to be considering over the next few hours with just an amazing lineup of expert speakers. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first moderator, who will in turn introduce her panel. I first met Sally Hatcher in my early months living in Colorado, and she was not only immediately welcoming, but had a keen eye for the tech community in and around the state and beyond. Sally is the Senior Director of Venture Development at CU Boulder, providing educational and experiential resource for campus inventors wanting to commercialize their work. Sally, thank you so much for all you do. Thanks for being here today, and please take it away.
Thank you, Amy. I am so delighted to be here today with Silicon Flatirons. I have enjoyed Silicon Flatirons programming for many years because I think it's on point and talks about some of the issues that we want to have conversations around, and we think really build a greater understanding of where is technology going and how do we address it? How do we be a part of the conversation rather than just being either users or steamrolled by it? So thanks for being here today. So I want to start with introductions of three rock star panelists. Newton Campbell, Lisa Neal-Graves, and Victoria Espinel are all absolute trendsetters in their area of expertise, have thought about technology and ethical issues for a good while, and really are going to make a very exciting panel. So instead of me introducing them, we're just going to jump right in, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to talk for about 5 minutes about just who they are, a little bit about their background, and then I'm going to start off with a very first question of just a definition. You know, how do you define ethical technology, or what is it you think about when you try to think about ethics and technology in the same sentence? So with that, let's kick it off. Lisa, could you please introduce yourself?
Sorry, good morning. Thanks so much, Sally. I appreciate it. And it's always a pleasure to be with Silicon Flatirons. My name is Lisa Neal-Graves. I have been a technologist and in new product introduction most, if not all, of my career. I began my career as a computer scientist with emphasis in applied math, and moved to engineering management because I wanted to be able to market better the new solutions that we were introducing. I started in communications at a time when communications from a telecommunications perspective and data were coming together. And then ultimately found myself getting a law degree because I was having a hard time with our lawyers, allowing me to get beyond the risk that they said that I was adding to the business. And so much of who I am and what I have done in my career has really been in that innovative space. And it's true that they say there's nothing new under the sun, but honestly, there are ways that you might use technology that wasn't necessarily contemplated at the point at which it was originally developed, or ways that you might merge technology that allow you to use it differently than you had anticipated when it was originally developed. And that has been the space that I've stood in. And I am excited to talk about this from an ethics perspective, because a lot of that work really was tied to times when people weren't really thinking a lot about issues of privacy when we talk about data use, or even being able to track someone when we talk about just device level information and insight. And so these are all things that have evolved, and things that when you have a group of people that are working on it, it gives you an opportunity to sort of talk about all the elements of it coming from different vantage points and personalities. And so I'm excited about this particular talk and the number of people that will have a different vantage point or a different perspective that can be added to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lisa. Victoria, can you introduce yourself and just a thought on ethics and tech?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Victoria Espinel. I'm the CEO of the Business Software Alliance and the president of our foundation, software.org. So just a little bit, and we work on global technology policy around the world. A little bit on me and my background. So I am a lawyer by training. My father immigrated to the United States from Colombia many years ago, and I went to law school with the intention of becoming an immigration lawyer, but through a series of happy accidents, ended up becoming a technology policy lawyer and expert. And among the experiences in my background, I would highlight, I was a trade negotiator for the United States. And kind of started the intellectual property and innovation departments that work on the trade negotiations with other countries. And through that opportunity, negotiated with over 60, 70 countries for the United States. I also I did a brief stint as a law professor, and I had the enormous honor then of being asked by President Obama to come to the White House to start a new office in the White House that focused on intellectual property. And intersected with a number of the policy issues that we're going to be talking about today and that I work on today in my current job as CEO of BSA. So very excited to be here. I will say my background has led me to think about a number of these issues. One of those is sort of the example that the United States is or can be. And by that, I mean not just the United States and the US government, but also the US industry, the enormous impact that we have, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional around the world, and the consequences of that. And then second, kind of building on what Lisa was talking about, the intentional and unintentional consequences of technology and the impact that it has on people's lives, and how to be as thoughtful as possible about maximizing the benefit there and being aware of the challenges.
Thanks, Victoria. That's super interesting. And I definitely want to come back to this question of intentionality. I think that's going to be a big cornerstone, I guess you'd say, in a conversation around ethics and tech. Newton, welcome. And can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, and thank you to our panelists. I'm lucky to be online with such great and awesome panelists. So my name's Newton Campbell. Through SAIC, I serve on the data science team under the Office of the Chief Information Officer at NASA Langley Research Center. I kind of serve between NASA Langley and NASA Goddard Space Flight Center up here in Washington, D.C. There, we combine our digital transformation thrust at NASA with artificial intelligence and machine learning. By doing this, we help scientists, engineers, as well as people in the enterprise take on new technologies that are rooted in artificial intelligence. Our work ranges from using AI for intelligent urban air aviation to detecting cancer-causing space radiation to developing intelligent dashboards that help the enterprise with decision-making, strategy, budget, et cetera, et cetera. And as our group lead is helping to frame the AI ethics strategy for the entire agency, we really have the ability to be out front with establishing a number of processes and methods for advancing understanding of concrete ethical use of technology and implementation of technology on ongoing projects. That's something that the government sits in a unique position to do, particularly organizations like NASA, where it's not just about the end product that we develop, it's about how we go about developing that product. Because at the end of the day, our charter is to inform the public. And so if we can do some technology development, if we can do science and engineering while informing the public, the better. And so with respect to that, ethical AI has been on our mind. In April of 2021, we actually put out a NASA AI ethical framework, basically stating what our qualitative principles are, knowing that it's a living document, much like other organizations, knowing that it is something that may change over time, but at least putting a stake in the ground to say, hey, these are the principles that we're moving towards, and here's the reasoning behind it. Now, how do I define ethical tech? So when thinking about this, my instinctive response is always to say that you can't develop ethical tech. There's no such thing, and that it's dependent on how it's used, and that I can only do so much, and that in my consulting business, we can only do so much. And if I'm working with the government to develop AI on a mission, that they can only do so much. Now, let me say that's my instinctive response. I said that very deliberately. And I think an acknowledgement that that response is flawed, and that those flaws come from a classical training in computer science and experiences in and around those in the field, is at the root of the overall problem that we have in the field of ethical technology, and particularly ethical AI. And that's a point I do want to touch on a bit later, is that the training, the background, all of the stuff behind this, that culture was not a culture that was necessarily amenable to considering ethics. It was a culture that was more amenable to considering function and what you can do. And that now we are shifting into a world where we have to consider more of ethics. That really needs to be a fundamental part of the training. So with that said, I do look at saying that a technology is ethical. It gives me the same feeling as saying that a technology is secure. You're never going to have something that's perfectly secure, much like you'll never have something that has a perfect consideration of ethics. Nonetheless, you can have a secure technology. And all that usually means is that you've given appropriate consideration of security at every step of the process. You didn't just bolt it on at the end. It's a fundamental piece of the process. And we can use both qualitative and quantitative measurements to evaluate the technology at every step of the process. So akin to that, ethical tech is technology where ethical considerations and measurement of those considerations are infused into every step of the technology process. And that's a broad definition, but we can get to some examples down the line.
Oh, wow. What a great place to start. So just to back up for a second, it's super interesting who's in the room. 3 of us do have a law degree. Newton has a PhD in computer science. All 4 of us have worked for the government, either state or federal. At least 2 of us have been entrepreneurs. All of us have had really entrepreneurial thinking about getting technology into use that was formerly in a lab or new ideas. So, kind of a real broad basis here. And I want to jump right back into that, Newton, on ethical technology is kind of bringing the appropriate consideration to the technology and then measuring that. I think that's super interesting, but I'm maybe even more interested in the fact that you don't intuitively think that you can have ethical tech. So let's just start there. Why can't you? What's grabbing you to say this isn't a go?
Well, like I said, my point was that is the instinctive response due to the training. I think that you can have ethical technology. I just want to make that clear. You can have it, but the instinctive response, and one that is a part of the culture of computer science, is kind of akin to the culture. Something that I've seen that's a part of the culture of science in general, which is kind of passing the burden of responsibility. Largely, when you ask scientists, chemists, physicists, and I'm not going to name explicit names, none of them who work at NASA, of course. But usually when you ask scientists and engineers, well, have you considered how this technology can be misused, or how have you considered how the results of your science can be misused? A lot of the answers that you hear are passing the burden of responsibility onto the people that take it on, or passing the burden of responsibility onto the users in the case of technology. And one thing that one thing that has to shift, particularly due to artificial intelligence, where you have the things that you created in some cases operating on their own, is that burden of responsibility needs to be on the developers and the designers and the people that are actually creating the technology itself. So the reason that the instinctive response is, oh, you can't have ethical tech because it's not there, there's no perfect code of there's no perfect code of ethics out there, is because most people are considering, well, users can do whatever they want with it, other stakeholders can do whatever they want with it, and it's a misreading or a misunderstanding of what folks are looking for when you're talking about ethical tech, right? People will just want to know that you've actually considered these things and are actually taking measurements that are aligned with either common values or the values of your organization.
Interesting. Okay, so you're kind of defining ethical tech as technology designed by people who have ethics in mind and maybe have been trained to think about the ethics of their technology as they're designing.
Correct.
Interesting. Let me turn that around. Lisa, would you agree? Is that, is that the standard for ethical technology, or is there something different around accountability?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I work for an organization that is really focused on right now being able to figure out use of space utilizing sensor technology, which also means that there is a potential for them to grab information that potentially could expose private information potentially. But they designed the solution, it's Zazu Sensors, but they designed their solution intentionally not to capture the details of the individual or even particular personal information, but really to be able to look at, sort of what's happening in a space and make inferences and provide analytics based on those inferences. Now, that wasn't, I don't believe, intentionally driven by sort of this logic or ethical thinking per se, but there was something to be said about consideration for the specifics of privacy, just knowing how people are today about privacy security, right? And I think, the one question that I ask, and Newton, you're spot on when you were talking about sort of the computer science sort of thought and process. It really is, does it work, right? Can I get it to work, right? It is really about, can I make it functional so that it does what I say it does? And then you worry about what the other issues are, right? The first things first. But I think that the engineers that I'm talking about that have been working on this have focused less. If I had asked them, did they have in mind right up front ethics, they would have probably said no, right? But now they can look back on it and say, yeah, that was a very ethically responsible way to design this thing. But they were looking more at some of the specifics of the issues at hand today. And I do think that sort of drives people's consideration, right? So privacy is an issue. So they thought about issues, but not necessarily, privacy specifically, but not necessarily in the context of ethical privacy, if that makes sense, right? And so I do think when we talk about how people go about doing things, one of the core, and I know you'll get to this later, but one of the core considerations that we really need to have that gets you to sort of the ethics of technology is who's on the team, and what are the perspectives of those individuals on the team, and what are they bringing to the table that allows them to sort of think about all of the potential implications of that technology. And that in and of itself will start to give you sort of the underpinnings of ethics, but it wouldn't necessarily, I keep coming back to, I just don't know that technologists generally think in terms of ethics unless they are a part of a multi-discipline team where you've got somebody on the team specifically that is focused on ethics. But generally speaking, if you got an engineering team, they're really focused on the functionality and what problem they're trying to solve and can they get it to work. and what's the best way that they can get it to work. And if there are issues like privacy, they're going to definitely think about privacy, but they're not going to think about it in the grander scheme of ethics. That's my take on it.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, and certainly around, I mean, functionality, that is everyone's goal. So I really like your point. We'll come back to this on kind of ways to ensure ethics, and team would be an automatic place to start. Victoria, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll talk about an area where we've been thinking about a lot, where we're trying to bring together kind of how to think about one particular issue. So in this case, it's artificial intelligence and trying to avoid skewed outcomes because of bias, and how to build that into the design process, the design development and deployment process to address exactly what Newton and Lisa have been talking about. So, artificial intelligence been around for a long time, but the sort of widespread commercial use of it is still relatively new, right? So I think in that sense, it's still nascent, I think, in terms of widespread use, and certainly in terms of policy. We're all aware that it can be used in many ways. Newton already talked about some of the highlights there. It can be used, I think, to help reduce discrimination. So banks, for example, can use, if they're using AI in the right way, it is a data-driven approach, focused on humans, and it can help reduce some of the risk of discriminations. But we all know that there are real risks of exacerbating social inequities that exist today through artificial intelligence if it's not being designed, developed, or deployed in the right way. And I'll focus on those three. At BSA, we've thought a lot about this for a number of years, and we launched earlier this year in May a framework that is focused specifically on the design, development, and deployment of artificial intelligence, and doing it in a way that will help mitigate the risk of bias. And I'd be delighted to share that with anyone that is interested. But in the framework, one of the things that we focused on is a tool called impact assessments. And we believe that impact assessments can be very beneficial in terms of reducing the risk. They have a couple of things that they can do in particular. One is they can help identify risks, and identifying them help mitigate the risks of those skewed outcomes. A second thing that's really important for us is increasing transparency in the process. And going to Lisa's point about stakeholders, done right, there are a number of stakeholders that need to be involved in the design, development, and deployment of artificial intelligence. One of the things the impact assessment tool can help with is making sure that those stakeholders are communicating with each other, and making sure that there's a clear understanding of who is responsible for what. So as Newton said, there's no perfect solution to anything, but we feel at BSA that impact assessments in the fairly detailed framework that we have laid out can be a very important part and really successful in helping to reduce the risk of bias or reducing the risk of skewed outcomes. And one of the things that it does is infuse it into the engineering and the design process every step of the way. The last thing that I will say, and I say this again as someone who's spent quite an amount of time in public service, I think there's a very important role for government to play here. Obviously, the industry needs to step up, but I think there's a big role for government to play here. And in fact, we at BSA have called for governments to regulate in this area and require companies to do impact assessments as they are designing, developing, or using or deploying artificial intelligence tools. We feel that they're sufficiently important that government should step in and make sure that they're a requirement.
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to lob that right back to Newton to build on that. Newton, when we last talked, you were actually lecturing on the framework that you've built at NASA to talk about ethics in tech. Can you talk a little bit more about your framework?
Sure. So NASA's AI ethics framework really reviewed a number of other frameworks. I saw quite a bit of the work behind this. One of the leads of our data science team really helped generate this report, and it largely came from an industry review of academia, industry, other government organizations like DNI and other groups that produce frameworks, as well as international frameworks such as EU regulatory frameworks. And the idea here is to come up with a set of qualitative themes, much like much like the ones that Victoria was just talking about, which development teams as individuals can measure their technology progress against. So things like fairness, things like bias, things to be considered that even if you don't necessarily have all of have people that are specialists in that area in the room, can be considered. One of the important parts of that framework is actually having people of diverse backgrounds in the room, diverse both in terms of demographic and background, trains of thought, et cetera, et cetera. One of the pitfalls that I see in a lot of documents like that, and you got to start somewhere, is that all of those criteria tend to be qualitative. The criteria that something must be fair, yes, that is a very high level criteria, but what does that actually mean concretely as far as what technologists need to measure? The criteria that something must be that your processes must be accountable and transparent, also really good. What does that actually mean in terms of measurement? So what we are researching right now, and we're not unique in researching these, there are several other government agencies, DARPA comes to mind with their Assured Autonomy program, that are looking at metrics for AI such that you can validate and evaluate your programs against these kinds of qualitative measures. The issue here, and NASA is not a regulatory agency, but going back to Victoria's point about regulation, is that there is no uniform sort of standard for what those quantitative measures have to be. There isn't something that allows you or Congress to check the box to say that your company is doing X, Y, or Z appropriately. And much like AI itself, congressional oversight of AI activities have to be more flexible and adaptive than traditional approaches to oversight. Just to include how Congress measures success. And so, with that, one of the things that I really like, Victoria, that you discussed was infusing certain metrics into the DevOps and software engineering process overall. And that's one of the things that we're looking at doing right now in a number of different programs at NASA is figuring out, all right, how do I take these measurements that there must be some societal good, that things need to be accountable and transparent, that things have to be fair and unbiased. How do I take those things and infuse those into existing software engineering processes to inform the public? So that's one of the major things that we're researching right now. We have there's a particular technology that is under development that deliberately has several AI components for us to sort of in a scoped environment really look at how we can do this mapping from concrete project to qualitative attributes, and we're going to be publishing some reports on that in the spring.
Wow. Okay. So we've talked twice now about who's on the team. So put a pin in that as something that becomes very important with the ethics question. Second thing we've talked twice about is quantitative metrics as a way to help identify where you are and what's the outcome. I want to kind of take that and turn it toward this bias question, which is coming up some. And to me, the question there is really around, where does bias come in? So is it in the design phase? Is it in the implementation? Is it in the AI where it's repetitively learning? Is it in the user interface? Is it the way that the user uses it? But where does bias come into the technology? And are there best practices or way to think about how to mitigate the outcomes of some of these, technology innovation that have an implication that goes far beyond what the intended consequence was? Anybody want to jump in?
So
I'll jump in and no, go ahead, Lisa.
no, I was just going to say that, for all intents and purposes, technology is designed from the experiences of those who are designing it, right? And so to the extent that bias creeps in, it's not like malintent, right? It's not intentional. It really is just, those are the folks, and that is their perspective, that is their exposure, that is their experience. And so to the extent that you can't find or create a team that has a variety of experiences and a variety of, you know, sort of backgrounds, because even with experiences, if your background still doesn't have sort of a perspective that allows you to see it from a bunch of different vantage points, you're still going to see it the way you were categorically taught in school, right? So I grew up building computers from the time that I was in the 6th grade, right? And I learned how to do that literally, if we think about it grossly, as a white male, because there wasn't really a perspective of a Black woman designing computers. And so much of my early experiences were taught to me based on rigor and rudimentary stuff, right? I didn't really start to think about, well, how do I want to design this, until literally you get to college and you start to have different courses that are taught by different people that give you different perspectives and vantage points. And then you build teams, and those teams have folks on it that come from, you know, it wasn't until you go to college that you start to get people from international areas. And so you now have perspectives that are beyond the US that are working on these projects. And so, bias in and of itself is inherent. And so when we talk about removing bias, I would love to live in a time when that is possible. But the truth of the matter is that I don't know that that is ever going to be possible. And it certainly won't necessarily be possible in technology, because the people who hold the power within technology are the folks who have the money to do the investment to develop, right? And so if those folks aren't really interested in getting, whether you build a team of engineers that build it, or you build, an access point to people who would be your target audience that is diverse and all over the map, somehow you have to fold into that development cycle access to a variety of different people who think very differently than those who developed it.
Victoria.
So I just want to jump in and say, I think, and Lisa, well, it may not be possible to remove it, but I think we should strive to try to reduce bias as much as we can. And I think, to your question, Sally, in our opinion, it comes in at all 3 stages. So bias can come in during the design process. And again, not necessarily intentionally, exactly as Lisa said, but nonetheless, in the design process, in the development process, and in what we call deployment, which is essentially the use of AI. So in all 3 of those, design, development, and use, bias can come in, which is why the framework that we have focuses on each of them individually and separately, and sets out very specific best practices in each one of those stages. I also want to note that while all 3 of the stages are important, there is still a relatively small number of companies, many of them quite big, but a relatively small number of companies that are designing and development AI. There are multiples of that are using artificial intelligence, which is why it was very important to me and to our companies to have all 3 stages. The design is incredibly important, but I think there's been less conversation about how AI is used, and making sure that it's being, in addition to being designed and development, is also being used in a way that doesn't exacerbate bias and attempts to reduce bias as much as possible. So in the framework, which I dropped into the chat, we have specific best practices for each of those 3 stages. Would be delighted to get feedback on this. I mean, we worked pretty intensely for a couple of years on this, but we know that it's something that's going to need to evolve. So for anyone who's listening to this, we are always open to feedback on the framework. And we think it's a good contribution, but always looking to, for ways to make it better.
That's so interesting. And Victoria, can you give us an example, just a concrete example to help us on using AI as opposed to designing AI? What are you talking about in the user space where you can see the bias issue?
So I think, if you are, for example, you're so there's so many industry sectors that are using it. I mean, now with digital transformation, like every industry sector is using artificial intelligence. So I won't focus on one in particular, but I think there are a couple of things that companies to be aware of. One is I think they need to think about the overall outcome that they're trying to achieve. So they may be using an artificial tool for a specific use purpose, evaluating loans. I guess now I'm focusing on particular sector or employment decisions. But I think they need to think very carefully about the fact that their use of that tool is not just about creating efficiencies in their process. Their use of that tool, in my opinion, has to take into account a deliberate intent to try to not exacerbate bias. And then in terms of how they, specific best practices for how they can do that in their use of artificial intelligence, I think part of that goes back to making those expectations clear. So they are either developing in-house or they are purchasing AI tools from other companies. So making that sort of a clear part of the expectation of what they want out of tools, I think is very important. I don't know how widespread that practice is at the moment. Others on the panel might have a sense, but I think that is a very important tool. But they're also, when a lot of artificial intelligence tools, when they're being used by companies in-house, they are then adjusting them in various ways or asking for adjustments in various ways to tailor them to the specific purposes they have, and making sure as they go through that sort of end design process that they are using, again, continue to use tools like impact assessments or the best practices that we have in our document to make sure as that happens, bias doesn't, or skewed data doesn't come into the process at that point, that will then lead to skewed outcomes.
Interesting. Okay. And I can't believe how we're blowing through the hour. So I'm going to push this forward, Newton, as I come back to you. We've been talking about bias. Lisa threw out there, that it's the money that really has the accountability. I want to just think about that for a second. So who is accountable for the ethical implementation of technology? Is it the designer? Is it the funder? Is it the company whose brand is on it? And how do we define accountability of technology?
So that's interesting, because I mean, there's kind of two approaches to that I would take. The one is more of the emotional approach, which is I am accountable for the things that I develop, and I want to make sure that ethics is ingrained in everything that I develop. But I am inherently limited. My programs are inherently limited by money, absolutely, but also by money and experience. I think accountability has to happen across the board. One thing that I like that Victoria really touched on was these notions of transparency and expectation management. If I can kind of sum up what you just talked about, understanding what the AI is doing, and having each of the stakeholders get an understanding of what each of the of what the AI is doing can guide how you define accountability. Right. So if stakeholders have an understanding that these are the impacts, in our case, these are the impacts that AI will have on a mission, and they go forward knowing that that we've defined those as acceptable, okay, they share some accountability in those cases. But as far as accountability when it comes to, for instance, your average industry group that's building an artificial intelligence or using an artificial intelligence, that's really where having people on staff that can actually help you parse that can actually help you parse the use of AI come in. And that's difficult because, again, it is guided by money. A small business that just wants to leverage AI to be competitive, they're not going to have an entire data science team on staff that can help them to parse, these are the actual implications of some AI capability. That's really where at least on our side of the fence, on the science side, on the technology development side, we have to continue to come up with ways of defining and communicating that to the public. And historically, that's been the biggest gap for not just computer scientists, but scientists in general. I often find that a computer scientist talking about AI to even a well-seasoned practitioner, that they have trouble communicating, even if there's a valid application of how AI can actually be applied to someone else's use case. And that needs to come again, I know people want quick solutions, but that needs to come through training. This needs to happen from a university curriculum standpoint, and should also very much happen at a job, at the standpoint of job training. But computer scientists should take some targeted instruction and practice in communicating the results of their technology to make things transparent to everyone up and down that supply chain.
Wow. Lisa, Victoria, any other thoughts on accountability?
I love the point that Newton was making about infusing it into the education process, right? We think about doctors and they are required to take the Hippocratic Oath, right? And that is built into how they learn, what they do, and all of that. And I have never really fully understood why that wouldn't be something, from any of the sciences, really any discipline, that you wouldn't somehow infuse responsible, right? Like being responsible. To Newton's point, I am responsible for what I build. Yeah, you can be responsible for what you build, but there are consequences if you don't align with who you've been hired by to develop that. But if there was some tie back and there was some onus on some sort of ethical requirement, obligation, et cetera, that is mutually owned between those who are building and those who are actually paying for the thing to be built, those who are developing the products generally, I think that you will find that the adoption of some of the ideology that BSA is doing, right? You'd find that there might be an easier process to align with some of the guidelines and the guidance that they are putting out for general consumption. But, one of the things that I also realized that technology, that was one of the reasons why I was so thrilled to go into tech and specifically computer science, was because it is always evolving. There is the point at which you write it down, you put it down on paper, it is already exhausted, right? There's already another way to view the same thing, right? There's already another way to do something even more, I would say, creative than that which you've already created. Like once you've come up with an algorithm, somebody can always create another way to do that same thing that is probably a little bit more taxing potentially on some of the ethics that you might or might not adopt, right? So I believe that there has to be some way of tying some sort of ethics obligation to various disciplines so that there is the mindset that says, we owe it to society as we build to build ethically and to make that a part of how people get trained.
It's what we did with security. 25, 30 years ago, security was rare. It was a specialization in the computer science curriculum. Now it's a fundamental part of the curriculum. I won't say it's perfect, okay? That security and privacy are not perfect in the computer science curriculum, but you look across the space, and it's at least fundamental to software engineering courses, things like that. Why can't ethics be? Why can't ethics and communication, be fundamental to the curriculum in that same way?
Just to underscore a couple of things there, I think there's two parts of it. I think one is in the industry, having companies make clear that that's a priority for the company as a whole. And I think that only works if it's coming from the very top of the company, from the CEO sort of impressing down the line that this is a priority for the company. And then going specifically to the education point, I just want to point out that Natalie Garrett put in the chat something that she has been working on as part of the Mozilla Responsibility Challenge. I know my friend Danny Weitzner, who was at the White House with me, we had a lot of conversations actually about this specific issue about engineers and have an awareness on policy issues, which often come down to ethics, and privacy, AI bias. And so he has started a program at MIT, which is designed for engineering students to learn more about the policy implications, which is often the ethical implications of the technology that they're building. And so, anything that can be done, I think, to make that more widespread, to make that sort of a standard part of the curriculum, to me, that seems like it would be enormously beneficial. And I think interesting, but also enormously beneficial.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you know, you directed us towards the chat. You know, to that point, to some of the points in the chat, there are aspects that are touched on, you know, particularly in the computer science curriculum, but in curricula in general. For instance, I had a quality assurance course during my master's, and that course, quality assurance, is focused on, okay, are you delivering a product that does what it says that it can, that does what it says that it can do, no more, no less. You know, how well have you verified and tested this thing? But in that, wrapped up in that course, we had a lot of conversations about ethics. We read, you know, nightmarish stories about unintended consequences of software that folks had developed because they hadn't made the appropriate considerations, things like that going wrong. So it's not that it doesn't necessarily exist right now in the curriculum, but it does need to be a little bit more deliberately identified and focused on, much like, again, security has become over the last 10 or 15 years.
Wow.
One
Okay.
thing, I know we're going to go into the students, but one thing I really do want us to make sure that we talk about that we haven't really yet talked about, and the earlier technologies were very closed networks. So you could control both ends of the spectrum and control what happens in between. But because we live in a world now where everything is sort of these modular blocks that you can build across technologies, it now becomes even harder to really figure out, you know, how do you ensure sort of ethics in all of the components and all along the way, right? So some of those things we have to think about it sort of universally now, whereas, you know, if you think about Apple really didn't worry about what was happening in the Windows space because they had a closed network and they could control what went on their infrastructure versus not. That is probably not as true anymore as it had been. And as that becomes more and more, you know, sort of the norm, which is definitely the trend, it's going to be even more complicated. So these issues of ethics become even more important for us to really think about what's the right process to ensure that all along the way we've got those considerations.
Wow. Okay. So this is such a stimulating conversation. We've been talking so much about training and about needing to expose people to these concepts before and as they're doing the job of creating and implementing technology and then using the feedback they get. Let's pause here and bring in some questions. Phil Weiser always said that we should start with a student. I think that's perfect. We're talking about education. So can we get a first question from the student audience, please? Hi, Alexis.
Hi, I think that's me. Thank you all for being here. This has been so wonderful. My question was, a few of you mentioned government regulation, and I'm interested in hearing what your guidance would be for creating regulations for technology that are able to keep up with technology's advancements, because as Lisa mentioned, as soon as you put it down, it's changing again. So how do you create policies that are going to be able to keep up with the evolution?
So I struggle. I know, I know, Victoria, I have absolutely no issue with what you're saying theoretically. I like the idea, but I struggle with how you create regulations, because what it does is it creates a safe harbor, right? And once you have a safe harbor, once they, you know, sort of meet the criteria for that safe harbor, then they feel like they've done what they were supposed to do, versus if you create sort of this culture of ethical behavior, somehow infuse it so that it becomes part of our DNA, as opposed to this strict regulation or rule that we have to follow. I think we get better outcomes. And I think that the work that you do at BSA would be great in terms of providing ongoing and continuously improving guidelines and principles and those kinds of things. But I struggle with regulation. I do. And I you know. I could tell a lot more about my background that would indicate what, but I struggle with regulation because there are some things I think that should be regulated, and there are other things that I struggle with how you do it effectively.
So, as someone who spent most of her career in public service, I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think most people in government kind of struggle, Alexis, with exactly what you're talking about. How do you, how does the government get involved? How do they get involved in an appropriate way? How do they get involved in a way that doesn't stifle innovation, but also protects their citizens, which, is the main job of good government, in my opinion. I guess I would say a couple of things. One is, I think it is helpful as a general matter for regulation not to be overly prescriptive, not to be overly detailed, because then if it is, you're going to be like on a hamster wheel of constantly updating, right? So as a general approach, I think that is one. We talked about the impact assessments and BSA taking a position that we think government should require impact assessments. But one of the reasons that we're in favor of that is because what should be an impact assessment, we believe, is something that will continue to evolve. So we put out this framework again. Would love to get thoughts from people on it, but it is deliberately flexible. It's detailed enough so it gives companies a sense of what we at least believe is appropriate, but it's also flexible enough that it can change. And so if government said you have to require an impact assessment, and and the impact assessment, and it sort of baked into that idea is that will continue to evolve, that will continue to be flexible as the best practices for impact assessments continue to be flexible. And to the extent it's possible for governments to do that, I think that is helpful. The last thing I would say is that, notwithstanding my background in public service, I definitely do not think that governments can do it all, nor should they do it all. So I think someone in the chat, I think his name was David, made the point about firm culture. That's incredibly important. It's, we're never going to have successful outcomes if it's not coming from the industries, for example, if it's not coming inherently from them. And in my opinion, it can't just be something that they're doing solely in reaction to government pressure. It needs to come from the top of the company. So, David raised things like incentives, management training, like those are all tools that the leadership of companies can use internally to make sure that it is clear that this is a priority for them. So I'm sorry, I could talk at length. I'm gonna stop. But Alexis, it's a great question, and it's an ongoing balance there, right?
Yeah, absolutely agree with the two panelists here. Like we said, NASA isn't necessarily a regulatory organization. We do missions and research. But I have talked at length with Gordon Stone, one of the deputy directors of DNI, about this through another fellowship that I work with. And there are a number of recommendations that I think that could be put in that I think Congress should at least consider in terms of doing oversight of AI and related technologies. And I agree with the points that you don't want to overprescribe, but it's very clear that Congress could be smarter about this, right? That's one thing. Education in this scenario is going to need to go both ways. We as technologists need to learn how to communicate. Congress needs to learn how to understand that communication so that they can appropriately regulate, because there is room for regulation. It's not that I 100% agree that we should not overregulate the problem, because not all AI is built the same, not all applications are built the same, and you don't want to stagnate your economy based on arbitrary regulations that are defined by arbitrary congressional understanding. But with that said, I think one thing that would be extremely helpful is for us to bring back something like the Office of Technology Assessment within Congress, where Congress has the ability to have a dialogue with technical experts with a deep background in artificial intelligence and related technologies. That's one key thing that I think is significantly missing from Congress right now. Most of Congress is informed by their staff and effectively lobbying in special interest organizations. I think bringing back an Office of Technology Assessment to at least generate a common understanding and to some extent, and I think we'll need this down the line, to be referees when it comes to how oversight happens, will be absolutely necessary. And then I think that there should be some additional alignments, at least for across government organizations, when it comes to actual funding of artificial intelligence. You know, right now in a number of government organizations, there's no explicit year or multi-year funding for artificial intelligence. So it doesn't necessarily necessitate across all organizations a review of AI spending and what are the outcomes of that. That's another key area that I think that if we actually establish some focus on that for organizations as large as the government, I think that would be extremely helpful, and hopefully some of that would trickle out into the private sector, because many of the things that we're spending money on are to foster innovation in the private sector. We push out our technology, DARPA pushes out its technology. A lot of those innovations, a lot of the innovations you've seen in AI in general, are owed to a lot of funding, but not necessarily funding that was tracked specifically for AI. So understanding that and how that affects the artificial intelligence environment, and the best practices and ethics that were a part of that can be used to establish metrics down the line, I think that's another key area that the government needs to look into.
What a great point on also how to track and follow the money. Really interesting. So Alexis, thanks. Obviously a very thoughtful question that stimulated the panel. So much more to be said there. So we have time for one more question. Natalie Garrett, I think you're on deck. Would you like to ask your question?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what Newton was just talking about is a really good transition. So yeah, Casey Fiesler and I have implemented some ethics assignments within intro computer science classes. And I think one of my questions is, and something that we come up against a lot, is what those courses promote is individual responsibility, right? Because we're saying you're an individual person creating code. But my question for all of you, and I think you're the perfect panel to ask this question, is how do we reconcile that individual responsibility with sort of a collectivist responsibility amongst everyone? Because, you know, those of us who have worked in industry understand that unless you're the top level CEO, you're not the one making the big decisions. You're writing the code. And so to put that on an individual shoulder is often inappropriate.
Anybody want to tackle that?
I'll jump in just very quickly. So Natalie, I completely agree with you. I think I made the point a couple of times. I think it has to come from the top of the company. I think that's incredibly important. That said, I will also say, I think employees have a lot of power, and you've seen employees using their voice more and more in the industry. So while I cannot emphasize how important I think it is for it to come from the top down, I also would, employees shouldn't discount the voice that they have. And I think, making it known that ethical use of technology is something that's important to them is something that we've already seen employees and various stakeholders doing. And I think that's really important. So.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Victoria. So this goes back to something that Lisa alluded to based off of one of my answers, which is this notion of, not necessarily a Hippocratic Oath, but something that's at a slightly higher bar than do no harm for technology development. And what we need, going back to another earlier point, is some form of protection for the employee in that space, right? There is an understanding, in doctors' offices for doctors that don't own their own practice, that there is a Hippocratic Oath, right? And that the things that have to come from the top down can't violate that. And there's a significant understanding there. So if we could develop something that identified, that there is a bar at which computer scientists have to operate in terms of ethics, maybe you could put some more of the onus on us in that space, and that would be a little helpful as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would just close out, Natalie. I certainly agree with both Victoria and Newton, but I would also say that the top of a company rarely is involved in detailed product decisions, right? Much of that is going to come from, sort of those tiers of management. And, reasonable minds can disagree or have various perspectives on how something should be designed or not designed. If you can get the core of those folks at least aligned on, as Victoria had indicated, some of the guidelines and some of the processes that she had put forth, as part of BSA, if you can get those folks to align on, some key principles around how decision-making is made, then I think you have the ability to really come to the best possible decision at the time. Now, you look back on it, you're going to see that there are always other options that you could have taken, but the best possible decision at the time is the best that you can do, right? And I do fundamentally believe that if you can get everybody sort of understanding, here's our obligation, right? Here's the problem we're trying to solve, but here's our obligation while solving that problem, you come very close to what I think is the most ethical solution that you can possibly have at the time. As long as you've got people sort of aligned with, sort of these theories and guidelines and principles and processes, I think you end up with the right answer. But I do struggle, right, with people sort of blaming the top of the organization with, sort of the decisions that get made, because rarely do the CEO really know or understand enough to have driven an actual design decision. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it is rare that that is the case.
Super good point. And thank you, Natalie. Great question. Really appreciate it. This is so interesting. And in an hour, we have only just scratched the surface. There is so much that I still wanted to talk about balancing freedom of, the right to free speech and the right to invent and sell new technology versus, a tragedy of the commons and a loss of our free speech and our rights. There's just endless places we could take this. Data privacy, we've just scratched the surface on. We also have talked a whole bunch about putting on guardrails. We haven't really explored more of the benefits of how can technology actually be an operator for good or for the common good. So, so much more, and we will hope the next two panels will take this and build on it. But meanwhile, Lisa Neal-Graves, Victoria Espinel, and Newton Campbell, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being here today. I thoroughly enjoyed it and really just appreciate your expertise on the matter. So thank you, and we will turn it back over to Silicon Flatirons.
Thank you so much, Sally. Lisa Nugent, it was great to get to meet you, and very happy to have been here.
Same. Thank you very much. It was a fantastic panel.
Yeah, ditto. Thanks.
Thanks.